Okay, so we're back for more of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. We come to the final fit or final part. And now, of course, Sir Gawain is at the Green Chapel. He sees the Green Knight. The Green Knight is very casual about grinding away with his grindstone to sharpen the blade of the axe, and then using the axe handle to vault over the stream and come over to Sir Gawain. And so now Sir Gawain, of course, is going to have to submit to the stroke of the axe. And the Green Knight grabs his axe. Gawain is down now, kneeling down, pulling his hair back, because remember, we talked about this before. Men, particularly of the upper classes, tended to have longer hair rather than shorter hair in these early periods. And so the Green Knight comes down with the first stroke, and what happens? What happens? He stops. He stops. But what does Gawain do? Yeah.
He winces, he kind of flinches.
Yeah, he flinches. Exactly. Yeah. And so the Green Knight laughs at him. Ha! Is this Sir Gawain, who is supposed to be such a doughty warrior? Is this the kind of knight that the Round Table can produce? Well, this second time, the Green Knight comes whizzing down with his axe, stops, but this time, Gawain doesn't flinch. And now he says, okay, enough of the silly game. Remember, the game-like business all the way along, the way everything is treated as a kind of game. Well, so also here. We're not going to have deadly consequences, are we? So finally, the Green Knight says, all right, get ready, because here it comes. And this time, I mean it. And what does he do? What does he do? Yeah, don't forget to press your button.
Purposely misses.
Okay, he purposely misses, and but does he completely miss? Okay, so what happens? He nicks him on the neck. Okay, he nicks him on the neck. And a couple of drops of blood fall down on the white snow. At which point, Gawain leaps up, draws his sword, and says, that's it. You know, the game is over. The pledge has been fulfilled. So, then the Green Knight tells all about the game, and he also explains about the green girdle. And the first two swings of the axe were not intended even to nick Gawain, because after all, Gawain did not give way when the host's wife, and of course the host is actually the Green Knight, right? He is a shape shifter. You write that on the tablet. A shape shifter. In other words, he is a being who magically can shift his shape. Sometimes he's the host of the castle, sometimes he's the Green Knight, as here. And so there's been a test all along. And when Gawain was in the bedroom with the host's wife, if he had given way and actually had sexual relations with the wife, then what? Then what? He would have not only betrayed his host, her husband, but he would have committed an infraction of the moral code as well, the Christian moral code. And he didn't. He didn't do those things, despite the fact that she came on, as we saw before we had our intermission, she came on very, very, very strong to him. And then with the third swing of the axe by the Green Knight, he just barely nicked him, because after all, what Gawain did was a small thing. He just withheld the green belt or green girdle. And while that was a minor fault, it was so minor a fault that it only deserved a very slight nick on the neck. So, Gawain realizes what has happened. Then Gawain bursts into a kind of anti-feminist tirade. This is in 24:15 and following. Through the wiles of a woman be wooed into sorrow, for so was Adam by one when the world began, and Solomon by many more, and Samson the mighty, Delilah was his doom, David thereafter was beguiled by Bathsheba, and so on and so on and so on. Well, this is very uncharacteristic of Sir Gawain. On the other hand, he is extremely embarrassed at this point. And so we have this outburst coming from him. Then in 24:45, we have Bersalach saying who he actually is. Bersalach de Haut-Desert, this barony I hold. Through the might of Morgan le Fay. Aha, well. Then we have in the next stanza, beginning with 24:56, Morgan's plot revealed to embarrass the court of Arthur by embarrassing its principal knightly representative here. And at the conclusion, Gawain has returned to the court of Arthur. He tells all, he is ashamed of himself, and the members of Arthur's court simply laugh good-humoredly over the whole thing, because after all, this is not really a serious embarrassment by any means of either Gawain or of the court. And so he vows to wear the green girdle as a sign of his shame, and so as a consequence, everyone in the court says that they will wear a similar girdle in honor of Sir Gawain, such a courteous and noble knight as he is and has been. And then the whole poem ends with the line, which according to our footnote, it's in Old French, and according to our footnote, is "Shame be to the man who has evil in his mind," which came to be the motto of the Order of the Garter. Now, nobody knows if there is an association between the Order of the Garter and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But nevertheless, such a connection is being invoked here. And the Order of the Garter, if you're not aware of that, is the highest or one of the highest orders of knighthood in England. Well, okay, so what do we have then? We have, among other things, a conflict of codes, don't we? Let me take this off so that we have the code, whoops, the code of courtliness. Which would include courtesy. But we also have the code, whoops, what's happening to me here? How interesting. Did I hit the wrong button or something? I may have. Okay. We have a code of courtliness, and if I could make this work again, well, then maybe I did it here. Code of Christianity. The code of Christian morality. And notice how these two things come into conflict with one another. The code of courtliness itself creates conflicts, as I was mentioning in our last segment. That Gawain, on the one hand, does not want to offend the lady because, after all, he is a courtly knight. And she is trying to cast him in the role of being a courtly lover. Remember the whole code of courtly love that we've talked about here before? With deference to the lady, and this even becomes a justification for having an affair with the lady, even though one is not married to the person. And so there's that, but he's also caught between the courtly code of giving deference to the lady and the courtly code of giving deference and loyalty to his host. But then also in the scenes with the lady, he is caught between the code of courtly love and the code of Christian morality. Because while the code of courtly love would appear to have justified such sexual relationships, certainly the code of Christian morality did not. And so we have a conflict between those two codes as well, which becomes a very important element in the work. Notice that after the third of the bedroom scenes, one in which the lady actually, in her unbelievable non-dress, gets into bed and gets under the covers with him in his own undress, and he allows things to go so far that if it weren't for the supernatural intervention of the Blessed Virgin Mary, he would have been in great peril indeed, says the poet. So, clearly there's a conflict here between these two codes. Immediately after he leaves the bedroom on the third morning, what does he do? He goes to a priest and goes to confession. Why would he go to confession? What does he have to confess? Well, look at what's just happened, right? And while it is true that he has not had actual sexual relations with the lady, nonetheless, he has put himself in a position where he was tempted to do so, and that, according to the Christian code of morality, was itself a serious sin. Not only committing the sin, but putting oneself in a position to be tempted to committing the sin was itself a sin. What is called putting oneself in the near occasion of sin in this Christian code in the Middle Ages. So, and no doubt beyond. Okay, so one of the things that the Romance is playing with, that other romances do not, by the way, is this whole business of codes for behavior, and what does one do when those codes for behavior come into conflict with one another. And that's where we have the interesting predicaments in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Okay. What I would like to do next, Scott, is I'd like to go to the PowerPoint screen, because as we are concluding the first part of the course, in which we have been talking about the Middle Ages, and we began talking about the prehistory of Britain, the British Isles, and let's see, can we go to the, there we are. And let me start the show. Okay, Remember I've mentioned Cornwall. This is from ancient prehistoric Cornwall. Cornwall is that little tip of England way down in the southwest. And this was Celtic territory. There is a field in which there are two of these megaliths. You can't see the other one because it's in the next field. And there was no way that I could arrange the picture so I could show both of them. They're, a few hundred yards apart from one another. And, or at least a couple of hundred yards apart. And so this is a large megalith, or great upright stone. You can find lots of these. And then in the next field is a circle of upright stones, which is known locally as the Merry Maidens. The Merry Maidens. And that first upright stone, along with its partner, those are known as the pipers. The pipers piping for the Merry Maidens in the next field. When we were there was a young couple, young man and young woman from university, who were on their vacation and were in that part of Cornwall, and they were dancing around the circle. And I watched them dance for a little while, and they were doing this for good luck. They were singing and chanting and so forth as they danced around the circle. And finally, I thought, you know, maybe I should explain something to them. And I went over, and I was very polite about this. I wasn't trying to be high-handed, and explained to them that they were dancing in the wrong direction. If they wanted to get good luck, the direction in which they were dancing was the direction in which you would dance if you wanted to bring down bad luck or even a curse on somebody else. Well, okay.
Which direction is the right?
To follow the course of the sun.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're going what was called withershins. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This is an Iron Age village. This is also from prehistoric Cornwall. And how are these displaying up there? Are they displaying well? Okay. On the left, you can see a larger view of the village itself, with one of my friends, Dan Suddeth, over there on the far left. And then on the right, this is an underground portion of that village. And you can see that this involves some pretty heavy construction, because you're moving around those large boulders, just like you are with those megaliths that I was showing you just a few minutes ago. And of course, things like Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a good ways to the north of where we are right now. Okay, but this goes back to prehistoric times. This is before the coming of the Angles and Saxons. I couldn't find a good picture of any burial mounds in England, but there are lots of them in Ireland that have survived. And so this is actually an Irish example from a place called Knowth, which is in the Boyne Valley along the Boyne River, if you know where that is in Ireland. It's a little bit to the north of Dublin, and if you go north of Dublin, about, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and you'd take a left going west along the Boyne Valley, and in a little while you would get to an area where there are lots and lots and lots of these burial mounds. Some of them small, some of them very, very large, like Newgrange is huge, absolutely huge. Okay, but remember, we have heard a lot about burial mounds, haven't we? As in Beowulf. This picture, unfortunately, is not a very good picture, and I brightened it up as much as I could with Photoshop, but still there was a limit to what I could do. It was taken on a dark and hazy day. But if you look at the top of that ridge over on the left-hand side, you can see that there is a line that goes down from left to right from the top of that ridge and then continues along the lower part. Can you see that line? That's Hadrian's Wall. That's the Roman wall, which was built across the north of the British province by the Romans, apparently as a defensive fortification to keep the Picts out of Britain and keep them up to the north in Pictland, what eventually became Scotland after the invasion of the northern Irish, known as the Scoti, into Pictland, and they eventually won out one way or another. We don't know if it was by warfare or by peaceable means. And of course, the winners get to name the territory, don't they? And so Pictland became Scotland. This is very interesting. I'm going to show you several pictures of an Anglo-Saxon village named Stow, or it would have been Stoa. And this is a small village which has been reconstructed by archaeologists and their students at the University of Cambridge and the University of East Anglia. This is in East Anglia, by the way. East Anglia is to the east of London, but it's north of Kent and Canterbury. But it's out there close to the coast. And so what the archaeologists have done is they've dug down into this site where they had discovered the remains of an early Anglo-Saxon village. And they've been able to reproduce above ground what they found below ground. You'll notice that this is a small dwelling, would be for a single family, and the roof, which is pitched at a very acute degree to let water drain off of it, and I'll show you another picture of this in a moment. That's thatch. That's thatch. Such a structure would last between 30 and 50 years. So what that means is that in a village like this, you would always have something under construction, sort of like Houston. You'd always have something under construction because the older structures would be beginning to give way, and so you'd have to be building new structures. I mean, you can only repair them so much. And then eventually you would have to simply tear it down and build a new one. So this was an ongoing construction project. It wasn't a matter of, well, you build all the buildings in your village and that's that, at least for a very long time. Okay, back to the screen. And this is, again, from Stoa, and this is a long house. And if you look at the one over on the right, see the white between the timbers? The white there between the upright timbers on the side wall? That's all a kind of clay which is used to seal the cracks. Because otherwise, you know, especially in the wintertime, you'd have very cold wind whistling through between these logs or split boards. Same kind of thing was true with log cabins in early America. You know, you've seen pictures of those log cabins. Well, the logs would not fit perfectly one to another, and so you would have to seal the cracks with some kind of clay or something like that. And then again, notice the thatched roofs. Now this is the thatch from the underside. I took this picture inside that building, looking up at at what the people who lived in the dwelling would have seen. Okay, now go back to that. That's a fair-sized dwelling, and go back to that. That's really quite small. That's probably only about 15 to 20 yards wide there, and about half that deep, maybe less than half that deep. And a whole family would live in there. So again, remember something I said about individuality and privacy in an earlier class, where I said that we have the luxury of having a good deal of privacy in the places where we live, sleep, etc. Most people in the history of human life on this planet do not and have not. So you've got people all living in very close quarters with one another. And so while, of course, they thought of themselves as individuals in some sense, they would not have thought of themselves as individuals having individual property and space and privacy in the same way that we do. So there was much more of a tendency to think of oneself in relation to the group. It's not that we don't do that, but we tend to emphasize individuality to a greater degree than would have been possible for most of these people. Okay, whoops, going the wrong direction here. Okay, so there again is our thatch underside. And here, this is the common hall in the village. Now, this is not a large village. And villages in Anglo-Saxon times ran roughly 50 to 150 people. And this building is a large enough structure to have accommodated, 50 people or so coming together in common. They would have discussed common business together. A lot of cooking was done in common. There is a large pit in the center of this building where people could gather around for light, for warmth, and for cooking in common. And there was a beam from which a chain was suspended with a large kettle, so that you could have a lot of food being prepared in that large kettle, things like stews, for example. And we don't know as much about early cooking here as we do about some other parts of Europe. But for example, in France, the pot-au-feu. Anybody, any cooks here? Anybody know what a pot-au-feu is? It's a large pot which in the old days would be kept in the fireplace, over the fire. And there are some pots which are reputed to have stayed in place over the fire for 100, 200 years. And people would just from time to time add, not from time to time, I mean daily, would add more ingredients. And of course, there would still be the leavings of the previous ingredients and so on and so on and so on and so on. This was a way of life for lots and lots of people. Okay, well, notice this structure. Notice how steep the pitch of the roof is. That is for what purpose? Anybody know? The rain, exactly. Because otherwise, if the pitch of the roof is not steep enough, the water is going to soak into the thatch. And what's going to happen? It's going to rock the thatch, right? And you will develop leaks. So you have to have the pitch of the roof being steep enough so that the water will run off rather than be absorbed by the thatch, or only little bits of it will be absorbed. But also, you have to have the pitch of the roof slight enough so that you can actually have a spread toward the bottom, right? Now notice all of the weight that's going to be coming down there. And what happens with such structures is there is a tendency for the walls to explode outward. So what they've done here is, look over there on the left-hand side. You can't really see it because of the angle on the right-hand side. See those posts which are at a diagonal to the wall? Those are holding the wall in place and providing support for the weight coming down from the roof. It's the same kind of architectural problem that the cathedral builders had to solve when they started putting the walls of the cathedrals farther and farther apart from one another. And so in something like the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, when you're on one of the banks, say on the left bank, below the cathedral, the back of the cathedral, you can actually see what are called flying buttresses that come up like this to hold the walls in place. But they are also designed in such a way that they are part of the artistic design of the building. Okay, so here we have an early and no doubt in some ways more primitive version of that same principle. But here's an example of extraordinary ingenuity. This is the inside of that door. And see the lock? And see the lock mechanism? That's truly extraordinary. And this would be a way of keeping the door locked during the wintertime when people are inside and they want to keep the cold out and the warm air in. But also, it's a way of keeping out people whom you don't want to get in, or perhaps even wild animals that you do not want in. And then here is the workshop. And one of the things that these archaeologists and archaeology students have done is they have tried to use only tools which were available to people in the early Middle Ages, in other words, the early Anglo-Saxons. Now look over there on the right, and you will see the window, and see how there is that braided material covering the window. That's what you would have as a kind of shutter. Air could pass through. I mean, otherwise it would be stifling to the point of being almost suffocating inside. But not a whole lot of air. A little bit of light, but not a whole lot of light. And obviously you can open that if you want to. Okay, now I'm going to see if this is going to work. Scott assures me that this is going to work. Let's see. Okay, let's open. What happened? Okay, Scott. Are we back on, are we on PowerPoint? Okay. Oh, I see what he's done. Okay. Because the dialog box is open. Well, okay. Scott, are you there? Can you give me a hand? Hello? Hello?
What are you trying to open?
What I'm trying to, I think I did it. How I did it, I'm not quite sure, but I think that I did it. But stand by. Are you an expert with this? Okay, I'm going to show you some pictures associated with the coming of Christianity to the British Isles. Now this is a statue, obviously a modern statue, to Saint Aidan. Saint Aidan was the Irish monk, or the leader of the Irish monks, who he was invited by the Anglo-Saxon king at the time, we're talking about the 6th century, to come from Iona, the Irish monastery at the island of Iona, which is off the coast of Scotland, to come over to Lindisfarne, now called Holy Island in modern England. If you're looking it up on a map, it would be Holy Island, which is right off the northeast coast of England. And there, Aidan founded a community of monks, and they brought with them the learning that had been preserved and developed in the Irish monasteries. And this is a picture in which, and obviously, this is taken in the summertime, so you can see all those beautiful yellow flowers. But you can see the remains of the cloister area, and down here in the lower right-hand side, part of the quarters as well. And you've got the water in the background because Iona is an island, and in the distance, that's the mainland. This is Lindisfarne Church, and you may wonder, by the way, that a number of the churches I'm going to be showing you are going to be in ruins like this. Anybody have any idea why medieval churches would be all over England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, in ruins? Sorry? World War is a good guess, but these are monasteries that fell, and churches that fell into ruins over many, many, many centuries. Any ideas? Did they have what?
Did they have wooden rooftops?
Well, they did have wooden rooftops. That's a very good point. Some of them did. Some of them did. Not all of them. Some of them had slate on the roofs, or even lead, which must have been enormously heavy. So, any other ideas?
Is it because when different monarchs took control, they had different religions, and maybe they were really against those religions, and so they ordered for those churches to be destroyed so that that material could not even be.
Yeah. That's very good, because you're absolutely right. Does anybody have an idea of what in particular? What monarch in particular? Do you have a...
Henry VIII.
And what? What did Henry VIII do?
The Church of England.
Right. He, in the English Reformation, he took control of the Church of England, right? This is getting a little ahead of our story, but in terms of ruins like Lindisfarne and elsewhere, it's not getting ahead of our story, because when Henry took control of the Church of England, because the Church of Rome didn't want to go along with his divorce of his first wife, so that he could marry the woman who became his second wife. And so he took control over the church and declared himself the head of the Church of England. Well, he turned loose all of these people who, were nominally aristocrats and upper middle class people and so forth. But in effect, they were really thugs. And they went into the monasteries, and they started beating up the monks, in some cases killing the monks, and drove them out. They took over the monasteries. In some cases, they destroyed them or burned them, including the libraries, by the way, and pillaged them for whatever treasures they could find. Or in some cases, they were allowed to stand vacant but fall into disrepair, as you pointed out. Especially the roofs eventually would give way if they were made of materials like wood and so on. And there would be timbers in the structure anyway, and these would eventually give way. And then, of course, eventually time took its toll, so that now when we go to visit these sites, this is the sort of thing that we see. And I'm going to be showing you some other pictures of this sort of thing too. Because this is what you find, and this is what archaeologists deal with, and historians who work with archaeology find. Now, they can be aided by the texts that we find, you see, the literary texts that we literary scholars find and historical scholars find. So it's really a kind of cooperation among people coming from different disciplines to try to reconstruct the earlier times. Okay, back to the PowerPoint once again. It's a nice picture. This is the island retreat. In the foreground, we have the island of Lindisfarne. In the background, we have the mainland of England, the English coast. We're up there on the North Sea, by the way. And in between is this small island, and St. Cuthbert, who was a very famous monk at this monastery, originally went out to that island retreat because he wanted to have a place in which to practice as a hermit the genuinely and strictly ascetic life. Remember we talked about asceticism when we were talking about the life of Bath? Extreme renunciation of the world and things of the world. But Cuthbert felt that he was still too close and still had too much contact with the other monks, and so he eventually fled to an even farther away island. Now this is Bede's Monastery at Jarrow, taken from down below, and you can see the tower is a typical Saxon tower. These, believe it or not, see those little windows about 2/3 of the way up the wall in this photograph? There's a third one, but when I took this picture, I wasn't able to get the third one into this frame because it's farther over to the left. And those are actually, believe it or not, stained glass windows. Very, very, very different from the kind of stained glass windows that we associate with the great medieval cathedrals of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, and of course modern churches as well. The problem, of course, for people in the early Anglo-Saxon period is that they had not figured out yet how to build supporting structures for the heavy roofs that would allow for large expanses of glass, as in the cathedrals, the later cathedrals. And that was an enormous architectural advance and achievement when people finally figured out in the 12th and 13th centuries how to move the walls farther apart and how to open up the walls to vast expanses of glass, where we have those glorious stained glass windows in places like Chartres and Canterbury and so forth. This is the monastery's side wall, and if you look a little bit over halfway up, you can see that there's a kind of ridge or indentation. That's where the second floor would have begun. That's where the timbers for the second floor would have been placed. And this would be probably some kind of a dormitory where the monks could have various working quarters downstairs, but they would have dormitory quarters upstairs. Or possibly in a large enough monastery, there would be dormitory quarters both upstairs and downstairs. Very few of the monks, the abbot and possibly, a couple of the most senior monks in the monastery would have their own private quarters. But otherwise, people would live in dormitories. This is Whitby Abbey, and I told you about Whitby when we were talking about the conflict between Celtic or Irish Christianity and the Roman Christianity that St. Augustine had brought to Canterbury in 597 in the south. Well, eventually the differences between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church in England had to be negotiated, and they were negotiated at Whitby in an abbey that was presided over by a woman, Hilda, who became Saint Hilda of the monastery, the abbess of the abbey or monastery at Whitby. Very, very famous. And the first women's college, and now the only women's college at Oxford University, is called St. Hilda's, after St. Hilda. Actually, I understand that St. Hilda's is the only single-sex college left in the British, well, in all of England, at least. So, and this is another picture of Whitby, which gives you a view of, see the rose window up at the top? That could have had glass in it at one time. And here's where the quarters, these would have been the women's quarters. The women, remember, the women were separated by the church from the men. So the women would have been on this side, and then the men would have been on the other side of the church. Okay, and now, if I can pull this off, we'll see. So I'm asking my friends back there not to go too far away. I have one more. Well, I have to close, apparently I have to close this. Okay. And come over here. Okay. Tintagel, which is also in Cornwall, is associated with King Arthur and the earlier stages, particularly, of Arthurian romance. And it's very, very high up. And as you can see, that walkway, it takes you a long time to climb to the top. And there are the waters below, and so it's very, very treacherous, you know, trying to get there. And of course, that's why people would build fortifications where they did. This is Glastonbury, which is also associated with Arthur and Arthurian legend. And this is part of the great church at Glastonbury. And this is another view of it. And here you can see the under part of the cathedral. And all of these cathedrals had those. And that's where people would be buried, by the way, or interred, at least temporarily. And again, that's my friend Dan Suddeth over on the side. I think it was his wife, Diane Suddeth, who took these pictures, in fact. Okay, and here we have Arthur's tomb, and I don't know if the writing there is large enough or clear enough for you to see, but this is right there in Glastonbury. And here, also in Glastonbury, with Dan and Diane Suddeth in the background, my traveling friends and colleagues, along with my wife, who's also a colleague. This is a typical 15th century inn, and this is very much like the Tabard Inn would have been in London, or a suburb of London. And also a late medieval gatehouse, also in Glastonbury, but you can find the same kind of thing in Canterbury and London and elsewhere. Here's the Canterbury Gatehouse. There's Canterbury Cathedral, one view from the outside. And then this is the interior of Canterbury Cathedral, and here you can see the intricate archwork which we associate with the great High Gothic. And this is the quest of the Canterbury Pilgrims.